You remember Doom for the Super NES, right? Yeah, it's rough by today's standards, but for 1995, the idea of a 16-bit console running a game like Doom seemed impossible, except for one programmer, Randy Linden. So recently, Audie and I had a chance to sit down with Randy and discuss his entire career, and of course, one of the topics we got into was Super NES Doom. We'll tackle other topics in future episodes, of course, but for this one, I wanted to share our discussion on Super NES Doom, as Randy muses about his time working on the SuperFX chip and making this amazing release a reality. So sit back and enjoy, and let's talk some Doom. Let's set the stage. So there it is.
He
yes.
set the stage right there.
This is Doom. What more needs to be said? 1993. It blew up the PC world, doing things that nobody could imagine at the time. Amazing game, but one of the big issues with it that you need to keep in mind, I think, is that personal computers were very expensive back then. Like very expensive. Not everybody had access to this, but people knew Doom, and there started sort of a mad rush from publishers to find a way to get Doom onto other platforms, such as consoles. But, I mean, as you can imagine, the idea of Doom running on like a Sega Genesis or a Super NES, it seemed outlandish at the time. But obviously, you didn't think so. So can you talk first about your initial experiences with Doom, and then what led up to you saying, I'm going to try to make this work on this hardware?
My initial experience with Doom was that it sort of took over. I was working at a company called Sculptured Software. They made Mortal Kombat. They did the Star Wars game for the Super NES. They were a very, very well-known, highly regarded publisher, a developer, and I was working on a monster truck game, which never came out. But at the same time, I had a development platform that I had written for working on Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Apple II GS. It was basically an assembler, a linker, a source level debugger, a graphics tool. So it was sort of a whole development suite. And a couple of people from Sculptured Software were sent up to Redmond, to Nintendo of America's headquarters, for a top secret presentation. And it was a room filled with developers from all over the country. And what we were shown was Star Fox, the actual Star Fox running. And we were just so impressed, it got a standing ovation. It was amazing. A decision was made that a 3D game should be one of the things that Sculptured Software pursues. And so a programmer that I worked with, whose name was John Morgan, who had done a number of well-known arcade games, was the one who was tapped to do the 3D game Dirt Tracks FX. As part of that, I was responsible for working on the development system. So I would come up with the assembler, the linker, the source level debugger, which I had based on the tools that I had already developed. And I had this idea, how are we going to work on a game for a new chip, the SuperFX chip, when there's no development hardware for the SuperFX? And the answer was, we're going to hack Star Fox. We're going to take a Star Fox cartridge. We're going to send it to a company called Dr. Design based out of San Diego. They're going to disassemble the cartridge. They're going to replace the ROM on the cartridge with a combination of a tiny little EEPROM for booting and RAM. And I would write a boot ROM that could communicate through the joystick ports of the Super Nintendo to the Amiga, so that the source level debugger could send down a program, because you would boot this. It was huge. It was maybe this big, this tall, breadboard that was basically this hacked up Star Fox cartridge thing that plugged into the Super Nintendo. And actually, if you hold on 1 second, this is the actual interface.
Look at that.
This plugs into the Amiga's parallel port. You have one joystick, and you have two connectors that go into both of the Super Nintendo joystick ports. So I wrote my own boot ROM, so when you turn on the system, it booted into my debug monitor. The Amiga connected and talked to the debug monitor over the serial ports, which were basically the joystick connectors at this point. And it allowed you to download code into the SuperFX RAM and into the program RAM, which used to be Star Fox, but the Star Fox ROM, as I said, was removed and replaced with a RAM. And so Dirt Tracks FX was in development, and I looked at, as I was writing the assembler and the linker and the source level debugger, I looked at the specs of the hardware and I thought to myself, this could do Doom. And I started work on a prototype. I want to say the rest is history, but it took a lot of work to get it actually operational. But it was all based on that original development for the Dirt Tracks FX.
Your version of Doom, then, you essentially wrote this from the ground up, right? Like, this has nothing to do with the original id Software code.
Correct.
Oh, which I don't think had been open sourced yet at that point, since they usually did that after their next project. Do you remember your first experiments with it, how you were approaching it? Because obviously the SuperFX was mainly focused on doing flat shaded polygons. And then, of course, Doom is a texture mapped game. And then in Super Nintendo Doom, of course, the walls are textured, but the floor and the ceiling are untextured. And I'm curious about all the different things you went through to get to that point and how you settled on this solution for rendering out the screen.
Good question. It was a process. Doom on the Super Nintendo, for example, doubles pixels.
Which Doom PC had, by the way. They had a mode called low detail, designed for 386 PCs, where you could double the pixel width, just like that.
Yes. So the double pixels is an option. You could, with the source, change it back so that it was actual single pixel columns. But there wasn't enough clock cycles based on the current engine design to also be able to, it was two things. One, there wasn't enough clock cycles. And two, there wasn't enough ROM to store the texture maps for the floors.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So I figured that what I would do is, in my tool chain, I have a tool chain that basically takes in a Doom WAD file and outputs it into my format. That was the first step. The first step was figuring out the Doom data formats. And a lot of people had been working on reverse engineering the Doom data formats. And so that made my job an awful lot easier, because there was a wealth of documentation that said, here's how this works, and here's how this sort of fits together, and here's all the different data structures that you've got.
Did you get that for Usenet or something? Where did you find that data?
Online.
Yeah.
Yes, the unofficial Doom specs were available, and they described things like the WAD format and the format of the individual chunks within the WAD. And then based on that, I figured out how the engine would operate, and then wrote a tool that allowed me to take the WAD and convert it into a more optimized format for the SuperFX.
The SuperFX, then, what is the... Is it actually the cartridge bus that's perhaps the most limiting on that? So you still have to communicate, because it has to communicate with this Super NES CPU and everything, right? And the memory on the system as well, right? And then, like, how much of a barrier was that in terms of performance?
It's actually much more complicated than it at first appears. The way the SuperFX version of Doom works is there isn't enough SRAM on the SuperFX. The SuperFX chip comes with its own block of RAM that it can read and write into.
It's like its little work RAM there is directly attached to it.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. That's exactly what it is. But it's not big enough to hold a whole screen in 256 color mode.
Sure.
So what I did was I divided the screen into 5 thirds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thirds. And you're thinking 5 thirds? What's up with that? The reason is that of these thirds, I could generate, and only 3 of them were needed, just like with the raster interrupts on the old Nintendo 8-bit. I needed 3 thirds of the screen to display a whole image, but there was only enough RAM left for 2 more. So what I did was I generated the display into the first third, then the second third, then the third third, and that's a whole screen. I started then generating the next frame into the 4th third off screen, the 5th third off screen, and then while the screen was displaying at the top, I reused the third at the bottom to give me thirds numbers 4, 5, and 3 again. The third was a common third, and so inherently the engine can never run faster than 30 frames a second. In practice, it rarely gets to 30 frames a second.
Exactly.
Very rarely. But in the technical implementation, because there isn't enough RAM available, the fastest that it can ever go is 30 frames a second.
I mean, the whole thing is like trying to shove like a square peg into a round hole. Because I mean, the Super NES is it's a character map based system, right? Like at its core, like it's not really designed for this type of thing. So it's
that's exactly where the SuperFX came in. The SuperFX, you could basically tell it at this X coordinate and this Y coordinate, put this particular color. And it did all of it's called chunky to planar conversion. It did all of the reading and the writing of all the memory, because the memory was basically multiple planes. And it did all of the hard work. I just basically had to say, okay, plot a pixel here and plot a pixel here and plot a pixel here. And the SuperFX hardware used a bunch of caches and optimization to make that actually happen.
So by the time it all gets to the video display processor, that's all been figured out on the chip, basically.
And it's a character map. It's still
exactly.
It's still a tile-based character map. Yes, exactly.
So you started though with the Star Fox stuff for Dirt Tracks FX. Did you actually ever have a version of this running on the original SuperFX chip?
Yes.
And what was that like?
At half the speed.
Oh no.
Yeah, everyone, a groan is heard across the internet. Oh, yes, because the original SuperFX ran at 10.3 something, 10.5, and the SuperFX 2 not only doubled the size of the available ROM to 2 megabytes, but it also doubled the clock speed to 21 point something megahertz. And that's what made it feasible. Although I have since learned of a new technique that I'm going to play around with, because on my GitHub, there is the full Doom source. for the Super Nintendo. And through the work of a couple of very dedicated people, one in particular who lives in Brazil, the Doom source, if you extract, now it doesn't include the content for obvious reasons, but if you extract the content from the cartridge, you can now, with the source that's on GitHub, rebuild the identical byte for byte match of the release ROM version 5934 from the USA. The reason I'm bringing this up is that the code builds, but it can be tweaked and modified. And a trick that I had heard about using horizontal DMA on the Super Nintendo to do the pixel doubling.
Oh yeah, HDMA was really popular.
Exactly.
Right.
You can use that, a special trick that allows you to double the pixels with the hardware instead of having to use the SuperFX to write out twice as many pixels. So I could theoretically improve the frame rate of the game by changing the engine so that instead of using the software on the SuperFX to write every pixel twice, I only write each pixel once and let the hardware do the doubling for me.
And you HDMA it, and then bam,
exactly.
It's faster. How much of a speed up conceivably? I mean, do you really think you could see like a doubling of performance? Maybe like 25% boost, if you had to guess?
If I had to guess, I would estimate that because the game fluctuates between 10 and 15 frames a second, I would guesstimate that it would hit 20, maybe 25 frames a second, which
would be really good for
which
that.
would
like,
be
actually,
really good. And on the PAL version in particular, 25 frames per second is the theoretical maximum, because the PAL frame rate is 50 hertz, and because it's got that weird 5/3 build loop, the maximum is every other frame. So 25 frames per second would max out the engine on a PAL display.
Actually, thinking of PAL, I did want to ask you, were you involved with the PAL conversion? Did you do anything special for the PAL region, or was it just like straight, just run it at a slower refresh rate?
It was just straight run it at a slower refresh rate, although the engine internally ran, the SuperFX still ran at 21 megahertz. So the slowdown wasn't as noticeable on the PAL version. The only differences between the USA, the PAL, and the Japanese version are that the publisher logo is different. And on the Japanese version, you're allowed to start any of the episodes on any of the skill levels.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yes.
It's a strange little tweak for that one market.
For that particular market wanted to, yes, be able to play any of the episodes, whereas on the USA and the PAL version, you had to be on skill level 2 to go to episode 2, and you had to be on skill level 3 to go to episode 3.
One question I have is that we've heard from other people, and there's been stories circulating about, when it comes to id Software and Doom at the time, they were quite protective of it, and other ports had more oversight, like Sega Saturn, for example. They did get feedback from id, which basically dictated how that ended up being a lower performing port. Do you remember what the response was from id regarding your port, and did you have any kind of feedback from them, things that need to be changed, or any kind of feedback?
Yeah, there were two things. One was that at one point a guy named John Coffey, who was like a Doom fanatic, had made a number of modifications to the Doom levels that we all thought improved playability. So we sent this to id, and id played around with it, and they basically said, no, not gonna happen. We want our levels to be as original to the PC as possible.
More Carmack, less coffee.
Exactly. More Carmack, less coffee. or more Romero, less coffee.
I guess so, yeah.
And the second thing was the auto-rotating map. They let me keep in the auto-rotating map because in the original Doom, the map didn't auto-rotate.
Yeah, it just scrolled.
It just
around
scrolled,
with you, yeah.
right, exactly. But I thought, well, we got a nice, powerful chip here that could do 3D transforms. Let's do the 3D transforms and make it so that the map auto-rotates. And they allowed me to keep that in. But I would say it was very, very easy to work with.
So you did use the SuperFX for that as well, because I was thinking conceivably that could have also been done as just like a tile map and then use like a mode 7 display.
A mode 7 to rotate it, yep.
To just kind of rotate the thing, but
yeah.
But you were actually plotting the lines properly.
Exactly.
Not just an image.
Yes.
Of course.
That's cool.
Have you ever looked at these other ports at the time, like 3DO and Saturn? What was your kind of thoughts on them?
I'm one of those people that when no matter how basic a program somebody writes, I'm always impressed that they've written it because programming is hard. But at the same time, I wanted the Doom port to be the best that it possibly could. I wanted as many of those little icons, like the SuperFX icon and the mouse icon and the SuperScope icon and the X-band thing. I wanted as many of those as I possibly could, and I wanted to cram as many levels into it as I possibly could. And considering that the Doom ports had fewer levels or simplified geometry, whereas Doom on the Super Nintendo had virtually unmodified geometry, and had more levels than many of the ports on more complex systems, I think it turned out pretty good.
Who decided the size of the cartridge ROM then? Because I assume that was always a battle, right? Like how much ROM space you're allowed to ship with. Like,
that's a good question.
When was that set?
That was set fairly early on. I knew that it wasn't going to fit into 1 megabyte.
No.
There's just no way that we were going to fit enough levels to keep people entertained in the 1 megabyte. So it was going to be a 2. 2 was the maximum that was available.
Really?
We basically had the most expensive cartridge you could possibly get from Nintendo. You know how they basically have cartridges.
Yeah.
And based on which mapper you've got, and if you've got a RAM on it, and if you've got a battery, and all the different combinations, there's a price chart.
Of course.
And we had the second most expensive cartridge. The only thing that would be more expensive is if we had the battery.
Oh, yeah.
That would have added an extra $2.50 for each cartridge.
That's interesting then. Because we know now that very few games, right towards the end especially, shipped on, I think there were 6 megabyte cartridges. And I'd imagine that the cost of that was extremely high. But now I'm wondering if Nintendo even shopped that out to third parties, or if it was like a very special case kind of situation, right?
Yeah, I think it was probably something that was internal, because the SuperFX only had a certain number of address lines.
Oh, yeah, okay. So maybe it was related to the SuperFX as well.
Yes. Yeah, because the SuperFX maximum size was the 2 megabytes.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about the impact that the mapper has on the ROM size.
If you're going to make your own FPGA, it's easy to add an extra address line and double the size of the cartridge. So you could have a 4 megabyte SuperFX cartridge and easily just switch which, half of the cartridge that you're using. But the SuperFX 2 only allowed the 2 megabytes or 16 megabits.
So you mentioned SuperScope, and this is something that came up after our friend Demetrius MVG did a kind of dissection of your source. And they discovered that the SuperScope was in the Reality Engine Doom source. Can you kind of elaborate what you were planning with a SuperScope in Doom?
The plan was that you would use the Super Scope and the controller or the mouse in combination. But the source that's on the GitHub isn't the latest version of the source, because that is unfortunately on an Amiga hard drive that is no longer operational.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's why the version of the source on GitHub is in the state that it's in. And it was only 2 or 3 days ago that I updated the GitHub with a number of changes, so that, as I said, now the ROM builds byte for byte exactly according to the official release. And the person who helped out, that's based out of Brazil, his name is Wallace, tested it on X-Band, and he was able to play 2 Super NES Doom cartridges against each other over X-Band.
oh my goodness.
Incredible.
I love it.
Do you remember? So Nintendo, especially, were pretty strict about violence, even up until
Yes.
the release of Doom. Do you remember kind of the feedback from Nintendo when this project was now shippable?
Nintendo was very pleased with the project. Yeah. We had absolutely no pushback. We had absolutely no problems from Nintendo. They were very, very happy to have the project, especially because the 32X version and the 3DO version, and there were a number of other versions that weren't as Jaguar. There were a number of other versions that if you rank them all,
Mm-hmm.
like somebody has, then you
Someone in the chat.
exactly
Oh,
someone
yes.
in this chat. then Nintendo was pretty pleased that their hardware didn't come in at the bottom of the list.
That's the thing, right? Like when you had a machine like the 3DO version, and we know the story behind that, of course. It's it's not exactly their fault. There's always those limitations there, but when you just look at it from a pure playability standpoint, you wouldn't have expected a Super Nintendo game to outclass a 3DO game at the time. It just went against what the whole thing was about. So
A 3D
that alone is
game.
exactly. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I suspect that the reason Nintendo was so happy with that was, like, this was after the whole Mortal Kombat thing, where they got their clock cleaned by not having the blood in there. They were trying to push the Super NES as like still a powerful system. They had Donkey Kong Country, of course, with its pre-rendered sprites. This was the play it loud era. So I think Nintendo was just happy to have anything at that point, and they were not going to
played
shut
it
down.
more loud than anyone, right? Doom was the
It did.
game. And
Yes.
yeah, it can't be stressed enough how important the fact that Doom could come on Super Nintendo was, because it definitely did extend the life cycle of the Super Nintendo.
And
The
it was
fact that
it was
there.
like it was probably the lowest cost way to play Doom at the time, right?
By
absolutely.
far.
And that's
Yes.
And that's the key, right? Because all those other systems were significantly more expensive. PC far beyond that. So being able to play Doom at all like this was remarkable, and that's ultimately what made it so important at the time and memorable, I think.
Thank you. Yes, it was a big buzz at the company that we were working on Doom. I remember when I want to say it was John Romero visited Sculptured. I've never met either John Romero or John Carmack.
Mhm.
Oh wow.
Yeah, never met them. I've spoken with John Carmack once or twice on the telephone, but never met them. And I remember once hearing that John Romero was visiting Sculptured Software, and he was the guy who was working on Doom. And this was before Doom was an actual project, before it was even a prototype. And it sort of got me thinking, if there's that much celebrity and that much fanfare around a game, which arguably defined the first-person shooter, or certainly after Wolfenstein defined the first-person shooter for many, many years to come, I think getting it onto the Super Nintendo was one of the things that broad audience, which sort of leads into our next topic. Having a broad audience and a broad base of games is exactly what the console manufacturers want.
And yes, of course, Randy is talking about Bleem, which is another topic we discussed at great length, and we will feature in the next part of this interview series. So do keep an eye out for that in the future, but that's going to do it for this part. If you enjoyed it, be sure to let us know, and we'll see you next time.